It's great to be here. Thank you. We're coming to you live, or as they say, it's a live recording. So all recordings are live, right? You do it in the studio. You're live in the studio, and that's recorded. So we're coming to you live, recorded, from Chabad of Rechavia. It's a tremendous zchut for me to be a part of this, and I thank you all for learning with me. I'm inspired by being able to be a part of this group. And today,
Gabriel, come on in.
It's okay, I'm still doing the intro. Today, Bezrat Hashem, we will finish the Rambam Sefer Yisodei HaTorah, the foundations of the Torah, with the 10th parak. Which means, that's okay. Which means, Bezrat Hashem, next week maybe we do a pizza, maybe, if you're all up for that. Maybe you bring your guitar. How's your back?
Doing a lot better, thanks.
Okay. It's interesting. So I come in from outside and wash my hands. Shvat Tov. Okay,
It's not too late.
And so all of the so many of the cleaning products in this country, the soaps over here, for example, the hand soap and the dish soap, they're very, very heavily perfumed. I'm on the bus and there are women getting off and on, and it's not like they're all they spray themselves with perfume, but they get up in the morning, they shower, they shampoo, whatever the soap they use, the shampoo. It's like there are these smells everywhere, right? I get up in the morning a lot of the time. I get very early usually, and a lot of the time, by around 6 o'clock, all of a sudden there's this overpowering perfumey smell coming up because somebody's washing their floors downstairs. Right? And I don't know about you, it makes me sick. It makes me physically ill. Like this, I keep rinsing my hands off now to get this horrible, flowery soap smell off my hands. And the reason I'm mentioning this is because we live in a culture and we live in a society where people, quite often, we're encouraged, I think, societally, to cover up real life instead of to dig down into real life. Real life is as the Buddhist teachers say, it's messy and it's nasty and it's dirty and it's smelly, and that's real. And if you want to live your real life and understand your real life, you have to dig down where it's messy and dirty and smelly, right? But so much of what we're surrounded by and what we're taught and what's advertised to us and very nice, thank you. Yeah, air conditioning.
Working good.
We'll do that, so much of what we're presented with is we're offered different ways to cover up what's difficult about life or what's unpleasant about life. And there's a difference between dirt and filth. I mean, those of you who spend time out in the out of doors, right, whether it's hiking, camping, hunting, fishing, whatever it is, right, dirt is beautiful, like the earth. It's beautiful, and at the same time, filth is something that if we cover it up with something that smells nice, it doesn't go away. That's how we create, disease and illness, right? Is by allowing the filth to stay there and say, I don't want to look at it. Okay, so we just came, Baruch Hashem, we had Pesach, and Pesach is it's not about covering up the chametz, it's about getting rid of it, right? And so in the context of what we're learning here, I'm just thinking, Rambam he's a big proponent of reality, I think, and not a proponent of pretending that everything will be fine. He's a big proponent of saying, no. We have the responsibility. We have the ability, Baruch Hashem, and on top of that, as it says in Pirkei Avot, or paraphrasing a little bit, right? Not just that God made us in God's image, but God let us know that we're made in God's image. And Rambam says, and that means that we also have the ability, the individual power and potential, and on top of that, the obligation to dig in and make things happen and change things. Right? So, Bezrat Hashem, as we come now to the end of Yisodei HaTorah, and this is kind of as we're going to see, as we Bezrat Hashem get through the final parak today, that this launches us now into the project of Mishneh Torah, which is how does a Jew live in the world, and the halacha, which is not, as we've said many times, the halacha is not an end in itself, but it's rather the means It's we learn the grammar not in order to be able to do grammar exercises, but able to be able to speak the language, right? We exercise in the weight room and whatever, not in order to be able to lift weights, but so that we're ready on game day, right? And the halacha is like that. The halacha is it's our framework, and it's our training, and it's our grammar for interacting with God, and for Bezrat Hashem, bringing God into the world, but also keeping our own awareness, right? So my bracha for us all is that we not cover things over with pretty paper or with sweet smelling stuff, but rather that we open ourselves up to the reality of life. And sometimes our reaction to it's going to be, oh, this is very unpleasant. Rambam, at the beginning of the Guide for the Perplexed, he talks about being in the garden eating the fruit. And he says, why is it called the tree of knowledge, good and evil? By the way, it's not the tree of knowledge of good and evil, right? It's the tree of knowledge, like colon or equal sign, good and evil. Meaning before we ate from the tree, we knew reality, right? We knew up is up, down is down. If somebody said to Adam and Chava, it's not day, it's night, they would have looked at the sky and said, no, it's not night, it's day. They know the difference between true and false. After eating from the fruit, everything now becomes overlaid with our own kind of personal likes and dislikes, which also, since we now humans are driven more by appetites, emotions, feelings, it actually becomes possible for us to confuse ourselves and not know the difference between true and not true. Gewalt. So we have a lot of work to do, and that constant awareness is maybe the most difficult, but also the most fundamentally important part of it. So, that being said, let us, Bezrat Hashem, dive in. Hano, please.
But the thing about truth is that we can never fully know truth, because we're all finite.
That's a separate issue, right? We certainly can't know God.
And then what we have going on is a continual revelation of ever greater hate against us throughout the world. So what does Rambam say about that?
How do we get from us not being able to know God to hate against the Jews?
Because the world is it's amassing continuously.
It's true.
I think we all feel it.
It's true.
It's an upside down world.
It's true.
So how are we supposed to respond to that? What would the Rambam say?
Well, that's a whole different course. we can take a poll at some point and step out and learn Rambam's, for example, the letter to Yemen, the letter to the Yemenite community, the letter to the Spanish, to the Sephardi community about the Shmad, about whether people should or should not leave Judaism and convert away. Those are very, very, very deep and very worth studying. Not what we're talking about today. Anyway, but important stuff. יהי רצון מלפניך, אדוני אלוהינו ואבותינו, שלא יארע דבר תקלה על ידי ולא כשל בדבר הלכה, וישמחו בי חבריי, שלא אומר על טמא טהור ולא על טהור טמא, ולא על מותר אסור ולא על אסור מותר, ולא ייכשלו חבריי בדבר הלכה, ואשמח בהם כי אדוני ייתן חוכמה מפיו דעת ותבונה, גל עיניי והביטה נפלאות מתורתך. For those of you who are not familiar with this is a little formula that I say and that a number of other Rebbeim say before teaching. It's basically asking God to guide me properly, that I will not say halacha is wrong and not teach things backwards, and that my chaverai, that the people with whom I'm learning from what I give over, it should be good for you, and God forbid not the opposite. And gal enai ve'abita niflot metoratecha, that's from Tehillim, uncover my eyes and I will behold the wonders of your Torah. 10th parak, here we go. So as I have said, this is my own kind of take on it, and as it says in the Gemara, we love our own chidushim the most of all because they're ours. And my chidush is that these 10 prakim of the Sefer Yesodei Torah, we started with creation, we moved from creation to Gan Eden, we moved from Gan Eden to Cain and Abel, we moved from Cain and Abel so we had the Garden of Eden, the tree, we had Cain and Abel. We moved from Cain and Abel to Abraham, to prophecy, from Abraham to Moshe Rabbeinu, from Moshe Rabbeinu to the giving of Torah. Last week we did the 9th parak, which I think kind of evokes, if you will, the Ten Commandments and the written Torah. And now the last parak evokes the oral Torah, which is not just what happens after Sinai, but it's what we're doing here today as well. That's what Hashem. And I would say that the theology that emerges in this chapter is perhaps the key to, it's the transition, if you will. There are practical theological issues that are raised, like in the first 4 chapters, which are all about creation, Maseh Bereshit, Maseh Merkabah. So there are issues about how God creates the cosmos and how the cosmos is structured. But here we're going to see, I think for the first time, something about the nature of God. And this, remember, it comes from Rambam, who says we can't know anything about the nature of God. And nonetheless, he's going to tell us something about a fundamental aspect of, a fundamental truth about the nature of God. And I submit that what he's doing here is he's now taking us and preparing, setting the stage. He set the stage with the first 9 prakim of this is the Torah, this is where we are, and now he's going to tell us, by the way, this is the nature, this is the essence that we need to know about the nature of God. And once we have that, we know the structure, we know the nature of God. Now we go to the rest of Mishneh Torah and learn all of the halachas. But this is the foundation. So it's not just the Yosodei Torah, like the foundation of it's good to know these things. But I submit that this is the pillar on which Rambam's whole project rests. And we need to come back to this periodically and for a refresher, if you will, and understand that Rambam has shown us how the cosmos is structured, how the Torah is structured, and he's going to tell us the most important thing, perhaps, about the nature of God and how we should relate to God. And with that in mind, and with that like under our arm, we then are encouraged to go forward and learn all of the halachas and how we should behave as human beings. The next sefer, and Bezrat Hashem we will learn that, is Hilchot De'ot, which talks about personal qualities and how we should train ourselves to behave, if you will, to be fulfilled human beings and to be a real mention in the world. But it all emanates, I would say, from what we're going to see here in this parak. Should I give it over first outside and then we'll read it through, or should I read it through and then we'll come back? Nobody. Okay, let's read. Okay. So last couple of parakim we were talking about prophecy. Kol Navi, every prophet, she'amod lanu ve'omar she'Hashem shelacho, eno tzarich la'asot ot ke'echad me'otot Moshe Rabbeinu, o ke'otot Eliyahu ve'Elisha. So any person who comes and says, I am a Navi and God sent me, we don't demand that they do signs and wonders like Moshe did and like Eliyahu and Elisha did. Remember, we kind of got hung up on this because it's a kind of a radical point, right? But he tells us that the signs and the wonders that Moshe did in the Midbar, splitting the sea and the frogs and the darkness and the blood and all that stuff, right? None of those was brought in order to prove that Moshe was a Navi, to prove that he was a prophet. They were all things that needed to be done in the moment, right? The only way to get us out of Mitzrayim and to show God's power and to destroy the strength of Paro was to split the sea and then have the sea come back over and drown the Egyptians. That was the only way to do it at the time, and so that's what happened. But that does not prove that Moshe is a prophet. And Rambam makes a very strong point of that. We should not confuse the signs and wonders, even that the greatest of prophets do. Elisha, Eliyahu and Navi, bring a child back to life, Moshe splitting the sea. We should not confuse that with that's the proof that that person was a Navi, right? But rather, he says that the sign, ha'ot shelo, his sign, whoever this person is who comes and says, I'm a prophet, shomar dvarim ha'atidim lehiyot ba'olam, ve'ya'aminu dvarav, shene'emar v'chi tomar b'lvavecha echa neda et hadavar. So rather, a person comes along and says, you know what, the sign of his prophecy will be that the things that he says come true. If a person who, Rambam talked about the qualities that make a person appropriate to be a Navi, a prophet, right? That make a person suitable for it. That kind of spiritual excellence, intellectual excellence, imaginative excellence, are being able to be articulate and to interpret one's own visions and dreams, right? And so if a person is of that outstanding quality, and then that person gets up and says, okay, I'm a prophet, as long as they're not trying to change the Torah, as long as they're not trying to add or subtract mitzvot, we don't say to that person, oh, okay, אין אומרים לו, קרא לנו הים, או חיה מת. We don't say to that person, okay, you're a prophet? Let's see, split the sea. Okay, bring this person back to life, right? Remember Jesus Christ Superstar, right? So you are the Christ, you're the great Jesus Christ. Prove to me that you're divine, change my water into wine. Right? That's all you need to do, then I'll know it's all true. Nobody knows this? Okay. Yeah, okay.
Right.
Or you don't want to admit it, maybe. Yes,
Right.
sir.
A lot of times the Nubbies gave over a prophecy and it took years for it to happen. So it seems like to me people could say, well, it didn't happen. Didn't happen. How did they reach with
like
time?
what specifically are you thinking about?
Well, a lot of times they said this is going to come, they're going to come and attack and Jerusalem will be destroyed. It wasn't happening for a while.
Rambam's about to address that.
Oh, okay.
Okay. All right. Very good. So we don't say, if you're a prophet, then do these signs and wonders, because the signs and wonders, as Rambam said, that's not part of prophecy, actually. Okay. Rather, he makes the statements, and we wait to see if they come true or not. Very simple. And now, even if the slightest bit of that prophecy does not materialize, then we say the person's a false prophet. And if the entire prophecy does come true, then we accept that person as a prophet. We consider him a prophet. Yes?
I thought we kill false prophets.
Yes, we do.
So how do you, if you wait to see if the prophecy comes true, when do you kill a false prophet?
You kill him
What was the question I had?
you kill him when you find out that he's a false prophet.
How long do you wait for the prophecy to come true or not?
So let's continue, okay? First of all, so Rambam's going to say like two things which are a little bit contradictory. First of all, he says, we bodkin oto pe'amim harbe. We test him many times. And if all of the statements prove true, then we have to consider this person a true prophet. Right? However, halo ha'me'onanim ve'ha'kosmim omrim ma she'atir la'ayot mafresh yesh ben hanavi uvenam. But he says, like magicians and sorcerers, they also foretell the future. So what's the difference between them and a true Navi? Well, some of the prophecies that are made by the diviners and the sorcerers and so on, some of them come true. Some of them occasionally don't. Okay? Yes, so he brings a pasuk from Yeshayahu, Ya'amadu Navi Yeshuach חוברי השמיים החוזים בכוכבים מודיעים לחדשים מאשר יבואו עליך. He says, let those who gaze on the stars, the astrologers and the diviners of what will happen in coming months, let them come and of me'asher, of that, from those things that will happen in the coming months, and they will and they should come and save you from what's going to happen. And he says the language in the pasuk is me'asher, from those things which will come. Velo kol asher. In other words, these prophets, quote unquote, these false prophets, they can say certain things, and some of the stuff that they say will come true. Maybe some of it won't come true. If he's a true prophet, he says it, every single thing that he prophesies will come true. If 90% of what he says comes true and the other 10% doesn't come true, it's a pretty good sign that he's a false prophet. False prophet, okay. However, and it's also possible that none of their prophecies will come true. However, okay. Aval hanavi kol devarav kayamin. A true prophet, every word of his will be upheld, will happen. Everything he says will be true. Right? Ki lo yipol midavar Hashem arza, because it says in Malachim, the God's word will not fall to the ground. Okay. However, the words of sorcerers and dreamers are like chaff mixed with grain, right? Well, the word of God is like grain without the chaff. Okay, very nice. First of all, practical application of these prakim. I'm waiting for a navi. I'm waiting. Okay. However, בדבר הזה הכתוב הבטיח ואמר, regarding this the Torah promises, שאותן הדברים שמודיעים המעוננים והקוסמים לאומות ומכזבים, הנביא יודע לכם דברי אמת. So the prophet will relate the truth about matters for which these, diviners and soothsayers and so on may give false predictions. So the diviners and soothsayers will give false predictions to the non-Jews, and we don't need to have a sorcerer. We don't buy into going to get our fortunes told or whatever. So Rambam mentions, in his introduction to his commentary on the Mishnah, Rambam talks about how in the times, that the other nations of the world would consult, that we would consult the prophets, the true prophets, regarding decisions that we need to make or what was going to happen in the future. And that God established prophets for us in place of the astrologers and the sorcerers and the diviners and so on. So while the non-Jews were, watching the flight of birds or cutting open animals and, looking at their entrails and stuff, we had Nevi'im. And a prophet, okay. So, and also in his introduction to commentary in the Mishnah, Rambam says that a prophet will resolve both questions of the nation, of the people as a whole, and also those that pertain to individual Jews. And so he brings this again here. He says, מתי שאין הנביא עומד לנו אלא להודיענו דברים העתידים להיות בעולם מסבך ורב. So, prophet comes for the purpose of telling us things that are going to happen in the world. To tell us there will be a year of plenty, there will be a year of famine, there will be war, or there will be peace, and so on. And he says he will also even inform a particular individual regarding that individual's needs. So now, if you remember, and I'm actually just going back and rereading this, so it's fresh in my mind, but when Shaul, who became King Saul, remember he was out there and he lost his donkeys.
He got the donkey.
And his na'ar, his sidekick said to him, well, we have to go, I hear that there's a Navi. So they go to Shmuel to ask where the donkeys are, right? And these are the types of things and it's a legitimate use, if you will, of the prophet. We have a prophet, so we can go to, if he's a true prophet, he can tell me whether there's going to be an earthquake or a famine, God forbid, pestilence, God forbid, war, God forbid, and also, where did I put my car keys? If he's a true Navi, then it's legitimate to ask him all these questions, okay? And indeed, Shaul goes to Shmuel and says, where are my donkeys? And Shmuel says, you know what, actually I have a job for you. And we'll get the donkeys too, don't worry about it, but you're going to be the king of Israel. Dude, me? It's amazing. What a true prophet will never do is say that he is here to establish a new religion, or add or subtract from the mitzvot. A true prophet will never say, by the way, we don't have to wear tefillin anymore. Because God, that was a transitional thing. Now, Shivim Panim LaTorah, everybody has their own way to God, and people who grow up with different or not sufficient or whatever knowledge, they do what they can, right? But there are people like the Lubavitcher Rebbe said that the problem with conservative Judaism was not so much that it questioned the meaning or the application of halacha, but that it made a halacha out of questioning the halacha. Am I making sense? Right? That it's one thing to, like we hear the argument is like, well, we don't need the dietary laws today because we have refrigerators and we have antibiotics. Right? We've all heard that, right? Like in those days, if you ate shellfish, you could die. If you had meat and milk together, it would rot and you'd get sick, right? So now we have refrigerators, we have antibiotics, and we have, pasteurization, so everything's fine, right? So can I think about that and wonder why it is that we're still doing these practices today? I should think about that and wonder if that's something that strikes me as odd. I should definitely contemplate that, right? But what, I know better than God? Very simple, right? So if we accept that there's a God, and if we accept that there's a God that has, this Torah comes from God, however we interpret that as meaning, like, whatever it is, doesn't matter. If the Torah comes from God, then there's some basic rules that we're not going to change the rules. So again, as we've quoted before, Rabbi Nachman, who says, we should take the text and make it our own. We should interpret it. Whatever enters our mind, we should follow that and see where it leads us. But that's not the basis for changing the halacha. Okay? So how does, I was thinking about Inyana de Yoma, kind of, because coming up, Bezrat Hashem, Shavuot, the Matan Torah, Kabbalat HaTorah, right, the giving and the receiving of Torah. And in one of his books about Rambam, he's a very important contemporary Rambam scholar named Menachem Kellner, and he makes the point that, like, the reason that the Torah was given in the time and place that it was and in the language that it was given was because of the relationship between Avraham Avinu and God. That it was not ordained from before creation that there was going to be a Hebrew named Abraham and that the Torah was going to be given to his descendants, but rather God, like at the point of creation, God said, I need a partner and I hope somebody will pick up the phone. Right? I've used this metaphor before, right? It's like the phone is ringing and ringing and ringing. For thousands of years, people are walking back and forth, and all of a sudden, this one Hebrew comes and picks up the phone and says, "Hello, guys, this is finally," right? And so from that, says Kellner, and he kind of gives a kind of a stark example. He says, if instead of being a wandering Aramean or whatever, if Abraham had been a Navajo Indian, then the Torah would have been given in the Navajo language. The cultural setting would have been the American Southwest. Instead of grain, we'd have corn. Instead of goats, we'd have buffalo, whatever. And so the question is, like, underneath all of this, like, what is the core of the Torah's message? And we need to allow ourselves the freedom to let the stories, the verses, the language, everything that we read in the Torah, we need to allow ourselves the freedom to allow all of that to percolate inside of us as a way of internalizing the Torah and making it our own, right? Because the more the Torah belongs to us individually, the more we belong to the Torah. It's a relationship, right? The more it's like a friendship between people. The more we share what's deepest within ourselves, the closer we become as friends or as partners or as spouse, parent and child, whatever. The more we see deeply into the other and the more we show of ourselves, the richer the relationship and the more powerful the bond. Anyway, so now, divrei hapor'anut she'anavi omer. Prophecies of destruction or retribution, as he says, right? Saying, for example, Kegon Shomar Ploni Yamut, this person's going to die. Shana Ploni Tra'av or Milchama, that this such and such a year is going to be a year of famine, it's going to be a year of starvation, it's going to be a year of war, whatever. So when a prophet says something like this, and Imlo Amdu Dvarav, Ein Bazeh Shechasha L'Nevuato. And if a prophet prophesies all these disasters, and then the disasters don't happen, it doesn't necessarily mean that he's not a prophet. Why? And here, now we're getting into what I was saying in the introduction. We're now, all of a sudden, like the Rambam is like, oh, by the way, see this sheet over here? Here is a major theological point. You've been waiting for this? Here we are. All right, do you want what's behind the curtain, or do you want what's behind door number 3, right? Okay, so we don't say, hey, wait a minute, he gave a prophecy and it didn't happen. Strangle him. Why? Anybody? Anybody guess why?
Because they did tshuva.
HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Erech Chapayim v'Rav Chesed v'Nicham al Hara, because God is forgiving and long-suffering, slow to anger, abundant in kindness, and forgiving of evil. And it's possible that they will repent and they will be forgiven, just like the people of Nineveh, right? Remember Yonah? Like God says, oh, go to Nineveh and tell them, and Yonah says, you know what, it's a waste of my time, I'm not going there. And God chases him, and finally he shows up, right? And remember what happens when Yonah shows up in Nineveh? He walks,
Immediately
right, he walks in and he says,
even the king and the animal,
Right.
sackcloth.
Right? Who is this guy? Nobody knows who he is. He walks in, he doesn't say, by the way, Ko Amar Hashem Elokei Haolam. He doesn't say these are the words of God. He just shows up and he says, 40 more days and Nineveh is going to be destroyed. And immediately, everybody, they're doing tshuva, and they're fasting, like you said, and they're putting on ashes. And the king says, you know what? The animals have to fast also. It's like, it's insane. And God says, oh, well, you changed your behavior, that's it. Okay, no destruction. And Yonah says, you see, like, you didn't need me for this, right? It's an amazing story, and it's like no wonder that we read it on Yom Kippur, right? It's like that they were, all they needed was a hint, right? All they needed was just somebody to remind them. So it's like, you know, it's like they open a book, they saw the word Teshuvah, they say, oh, yeah, that reminds me, I gotta go to Teshuvah, right? Boom. It's like, it's in some sense, it's like so uppermost in their awareness, right? And if you remember when we said, the beginning of Rambam Hilchot Teshuvah, which is an amazing, such a powerful insight that he gives us right off the bat. And if you're just reading it, you don't get it, right? But okay, it's worth repeating. He says, "Kol mitzvot shebatorah, ben aseh ben shelo taseh, im avar adam kol achat mehen." All the mitzvahs in the Torah, whether they're positive commandments or negative commandments, prohibitions, all right? Whether on purpose or by mistake. Im avar adam al ahad mehem. If a person transgresses one of them. Ke sheyaseh teshuvah ve'yashuv mechito. If a person transgresses a sin, when the person does teshuvah, and regrets and repents. Right? Rambam is saying that it's not a guarantee that we're going to sin, but it is a guarantee that we're going to do teshuvah sooner or later. And he brings the psukim to do it, and you know, we learned it in the place, and we can certainly come back to it, right? But what he's saying is that there is a human propensity to do teshuvah. The Torah says, you know, when you sin. Rambam says, yeah, I know what the pasuk says, but you know, it's not a guarantee. It's a challenge. Because he says later, if you remember in Hilchot Teshuvah, he says, yes, God made a gezerah, made a decision that the nation of Mitzrayim, of Egypt, would enslave and mistreat the people of Israel. He said, but remember that gezerah, that decree, was chal, it fell upon the nation, and yet it did not fall upon any individual Egyptian. That every individual Egyptian had their own freedom of choice to choose whether to mistreat us or not. And so each individual Egyptian, even within the context of this terrible judgment that fell on the nation of Egypt, each individual Egyptian was responsible for and capable of making their own decisions. It's an amazing lesson. It's a Musar Haskell for us. It's like a, wow, what a lesson that we have to take from this.
Okay. You used, what if Pharaoh hadn't have sinned? Would it happen then to another nation?
If Pharaoh had not...
Pharaoh would have gone, everything would have gone smooth. Hadn't have...
Okay, this is a really different conversation. I think that the reason that it happened in Egypt was that there's a karmic process going on here. See, I'll come back and say yes. I'm sorry.
So how do we know he's not a false prophet?
Okay, well, we'll get to it.
I'm sorry.
No. It's important.
It's
important. That's a critically important question. And the simple answer, or the brief answer, if you will, is we don't know where we're going until we've been there. And that's the way life operates. And the Torah actually understands that. And the Torah, once we get deeper into it, we understand the Torah also shares and validates our, if you will, existentialist view of the world. Like, I knew that what you said yesterday came true. I know that what you said today came true. I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. And that's why we have the halacha to guide us. And we make mistakes, and people make mistakes, and we do the best we can. We mentioned, and Rambam talks about in the last parak, he talked about the legalistic process, where if somebody comes to court, two witnesses come and they say, this person committed a murder, I saw it, then the court's about to decide and convict the person of murder, and then two other witnesses come, it's called Edez Omamim, that two other witnesses come and they say, you two guys could not have seen him commit that murder last Wednesday, because last Wednesday you were with us in Chicago. Now the court overturns the conviction, right? If two more witnesses come afterwards and say, no, they weren't with you in Chicago because you were with us in Philadelphia, no, that's it. The case is closed, all right? So it doesn't necessarily mean that it's true. It means that we as a society, and we under the halacha, determine that that's the truth. It becomes the halachic truth, and it becomes the truth that we have to live with. The truth that we have to live by, because as Hanok said earlier, right, we don't know the true truth, right? We live in the world of space, time, and motion. We're encapsulated in that, and we're bound by it. And the Torah gives us, through the halacha, as we said, a grammar and a set of processes, if you will, or guideposts for living in that world. Okay, we can talk about this at great length another time, but very briefly, my take on it is, the word that is most used to describe our experience in Mitzrayim is enui, suffering or affliction. And whenever we're reading a text in Tanakh, it's critically important to go back to, as like Rav Shlomo used to call it, the headquarters of the word. The first place that the word appears in the Chumash, that gives us a core definition of that word. And every time it appears again, we have to go back to that first place. The first place that the word enui appears in Chumash is with Sarah and Hagar. And it said that when Hagar becomes pregnant, and then Sarah was bad to her because Hagar was like looking down her nose at Sarah. She said, I'm pregnant, you're not. And so Sarah mistreated her, v'ta'aneha, and she afflicted her. And that's why Hagar ran away. And Hagar was Mitzrayit, she was Egyptian. So the Enui and Mitzrayim are connected from the time of Abraham and Sarah. When God comes with Brit Ben Abitarim, the covenant between the pieces, Abraham says, what's going to happen? God says, your descendants will be slaves, will be for 400 years. Where? You know what it says?
It doesn't mention where.
Exactly. Eretz lo lahem. In some other land. That's not their land. It doesn't say where. So it's not foreordained that we're going to end up in Mitzrayim, but God says, like, here's kind of the larger structure, and our behavior pushes us to different places within that structure. So the structure was that there was going to be somewhere where we're going to be in a different land. How do we end up in Dafka in that land? Well, it turns out that like we had bad blood between us and Egypt from the get-go, from before Yitzhak was born, from before there was going to be descendants, right? So God says, okay, maybe your descendants and their descendants, maybe, that's the way it's going to be. Let's finish this, B'ezrat Hashem. So, yes, so God is slow to anger and abundant in kindness. And maybe we did tshuva, like people of Nineveh. Or that the punishment was held in abeyance. So you said earlier, what happens if, something doesn't happen for such a long time, right? So this does not apply regarding prophecies for the good. If a prophet promises that something good will happen, good thing will happen, so on and so forth, and the things about which he prophesied do not materialize, Hare ze navi sheker. This is a false prophet. Any good which a prophet decrees שכל דבר טובה שיגזור. Right. כל דבר טובה שיגזור האל, אפילו על תנאי, אינו חוזר. Any good thing that a prophet decrees, that meaning that God decrees, even if it's provisional, it's never completely canceled out. Right? God nullifies positive prophecy only during the destruction of the first temple. He promised the righteous that they would not die together with the wicked, but he nullifies this prophecy as explained in Masechet Shabbat. I'm going to come back to that in just a moment as we finish up. So we can conclude from this that a prophet should be tested on the basis of his positive prophecies only. This is, we see in the book of Jeremiah, he replied to Hananiah ben Ozer saying that he prophesied doom, and Hananiah prophesied a glorious future. And Yirmiyahu says to Hananiah, if my words are not fulfilled, it will not lead to the conclusion that I'm a false prophet, but if your promises are not fulfilled, it will be proof that you're a false prophet. Okay? Okay, here's the last paragraph of this sefer. When Navi are you okay?
Yeah, I'm good, thank you.
Okay. שהעיד לו נביא אחר שהוא נביא, הרי הוא בחזקת נביא. Okay, now, as I said, in my taxonomy, if you will, of this particular sefer, this 10th parak takes us from the world of the written Torah into the world of the oral Torah. When a prophet says about another person that that person is also a prophet, we accept that second person as a prophet without requiring any further tests or investigations. So, Hare Moshe Rabbeinu ha'id liYoshua. Moshe Rabbeinu testified, he gave testimony with respect to Yoshua. He said, Yoshua, he's the prophet, he's taking over from me. Right? והאמינו בו כל ישראל קודם שיעשה עוד. And all of Israel believed in Yehoshua as a prophet, even before he gave any sign of his prophetic gift. Okay? And the same holds true in subsequent generations. Once a prophet makes known his prophecy and his words have been proven true time after time, or another prophet comes and proclaims him a prophet, if he continues on the path of prophecy, it is forbidden to doubt him or to question the truth of his prophecy. Okay, I'm going to take a few minutes and read from my notes here, and give you a little bit of my take on this, and then B'ezras Hashem we will finish this sefer here. So we mentioned that God only, according to Rambam, God, even at the time of the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, the first Beit Rishon, that God also suspended God's graciousness to the good, right? So there's a Gemara in Shabbat, which I believe is on 54b, and going forward, at the destruction of the first temple, the good were destroyed along with the wicked. The Gemara explains that the good did nothing to restrain the wicked, raising the question of what, in the eyes of the Torah, actually is the definition of good, right? And we've said this in the past, right? Being good, according to the Torah, doesn't mean refraining from doing bad things. It's a much more complex, much more demanding subject. To be good requires constant action, constant awareness. As we said at the beginning, right? We have to be aware and mindful and be engaged and active. The Gemara raises other theological issues. One, death is not dependent on the actions of an individual. Everybody dies.
Unless the Mashiach comes before.
The Gemara to which, well, you know what? Not for now. Rambam has a different view of Tchiat HaMetim. He says is a temporary state. But Rambam says that the Tchiat HaMetim is there will be a time when we will all be physically resurrected and we will live for a long period of time, and then our bodies will die and we will exist eternally in a purified spiritual state. That his view of Tchiat HaMetim is not that we will physically live here forever. The Gemara to which Rambam refers describes a conversation between God and the attribute of justice. God commands justice to separate the good from the wicked, so God will know who to punish, right? It's going to put the letter tough on their foreheads, and one in ink and one in blood, so God knows which is which. And justice says, no, you know what? If they were truly good, they would have objected to the behavior of the wicked. God says, yeah, but you know what? It's okay, because I know that the wicked would not have listened to them, and they wouldn't repent anyway. And the attribute of justice says, yeah, but they didn't know that. God says,
What if they're afraid?
Yeah.
Doesn't matter.
I think the theology of the passage is very clear. God expects us to act positively, proactively, courageously.
What if they were killed?
To prevent
What if
evil
they were going to
and
die?
to discourage people from doing evil.
What if they knew
So-
they were going to die if they spoke up?
You know what? I don't know. It's how far do you take it? I don't know. It's listen. These are very tough real life questions, right?
That's what I see in the world today. Ruling
Yeah.
people, if they're going to speak up, they might die about it.
Yes, they might, and that might happen right here in our city, in fact. But I would say the theology of this passage that Rambam is bringing is very clear. And Rambam, he doesn't waste words, and he does. If he brings a pasuk or a passage of Gemara or whatever, he's doing it advisedly. We have to pay very close attention, right? God expects us to act positively, proactively, courageously to prevent evil and to discourage people from doing evil. And this, if you remember, there's a midrash, a famous midrash, where God says, "Naaseh Adam" in Bereshit, let's make Adam. And the angels, and the question the midrash has is, who's God saying? Us, right? Who's God talking to? Oh, must be talking to the angels. And the angels say to God, bad idea. You're going to create human beings, they're going to sin. And God says, yeah, but they're not always going to sin. And they say, no, but you'll give them commands, and they'll violate it, and they'll be bad to each other or whatever. And God says, yeah, you're right. But they're not going to do all bad all the time. And anyway, I already made up my mind, so thanks for your input, but I'm going to go create human beings anyway, right? I would say that the implication of the theology that's expressed in this passage that we just read sets the stage for everything that follows, which is Rambam's enumeration of the mitzvot and prescriptions for proper observance and living a proper Torah life, as a Torah Jew. It's important to note, by the way, Rambam has basically not made theological statements until now. Right? He said, we don't know, can't know. He's told us about how things work, right? But now he's actually giving us a moral, ethical perspective, and he's saying this is the way that God looks at the world. Now, like, all the pieces are in place. Remember, at the beginning of the Sefer, right? Rambam does not start by saying, the first thing that you need to know is you got to believe in God. Remember? He says, right, what's the foundation of all foundations? The pillar of wisdom is to know that there is some first existent, we call it, the first existent, right? And all existence comes from that. It's the source of existence, and no existence exists without it, and it exists without anything else. It goes through like a little philosophical, jumping through a couple of hoops. And it takes a couple of little paragraphs, and then Rambam says, and by the way, this is what we call the first existent, that's God. It's the same God which he now says is merciful and slow to anger, and who seeks to enlist human assistance constantly in combating evil. So Rambam is like saying, oh, by the way, existence comes from God, but the fight against evil, we need to engage in that. And how do we engage in that? I submit that part of the way that we engage in that, a key way that we engage in that, is by embracing the mitzvot, learning not just to do the mitzvot, but each, as Ramban says, right, there are not 613 things that can happen in the course of a human life. There are infinite numbers of things that happen in the course of human life, and 613 mitzvot are 613 categories of principles, and within each category we have specific behaviors, other mitzvot, and those mitzvot are further principles, there are further refinements of the principles, but God doesn't, you don't open the Torah and God tells you in every moment, every decision we have to make, which way to go, which person to marry, which, etc., 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 right? But the more we train ourselves in Torah and mitzvot, the more we have the hashkafa, the point of view, the perspective of the Torah to help to guide us to making all the decisions that we have to make in the course of our lives. So the mitzvot themselves are a guide for us to help us to live the best life that we can as individuals and as Jews in this world. What's the purpose of prophecy? It's to correct people's behavior. What's the purpose of...
Are you saying that 613 is going to help us speak up against evil?
Yes. For example,
It'll give us
yes.
the courage, the wisdom, the knowledge.
You know what? So the way I look at it, I mean, that Chazal were pretty smart. The rabbis, they were pretty smart, right? And they understand that there are times and places where we have to do things that we might not be inclined to do, or might not think of doing, or might not want to do, or might be afraid to do. And the more we internalize the mitzvot, let's take something much simpler, right? Like there's a mitzvah to stand up when in front of an older person. And how much older does that person have to be? You know, the Arizal says it's 60, which I think he takes from Pirkei Avot. Some people say it's 70, whatever, okay? So, and by the way, it's like the simplest mitzvah to do, right? If you're keeping the checklist, keeping score, like, oh, I see somebody with white hair walk in the room, I stand up, I just, bing, you know, I just got a point, right? So, how about like the idea of, I don't know, giving your seat to somebody else on the bus, right? So you might say, well, that's just, you know, people who are well brought up will do that, right? But how about somebody who's well brought up and also brought up in Torah, right? It's a difference. Somebody who's well brought up says, oh, you know, I see an older person get up, I have to give them my seat. Somebody who's well brought up and brought up in Torah says, you know what? The Torah says that I should honor this person. So to me, there's a world of difference between the inner process of a person who says, I need to get up and give that person my seat because it's a polite thing to do, and a person who says, wow, the Torah commands me to honor this person. Do you see a difference? I see a huge difference, right? The Torah commands me to give charity.
But sometimes that can seem cold when you say it, because someone that does it, maybe because they have compassion, they feel it, and they say, hey, I want to do this to help this person. And I'm doing it because the Torah tells me to do it. Well, that's good. I'm glad you're doing it. You should do it because the Torah, but that sounds colder.
Well, if you can't think of any other reason to do something that you should be doing, at least you have the Torah telling you to do it. You know, listen, people like
somebody, I know in the past when someone's done something for me, they said, well, the Torah, I said, thank you very much. I did it, the Torah told me. It kind of took away from it. Oh, I thought there was more like a bond. But, wow, you did this for me, I appreciate it. It's not you, it's because Torah.
Well, you know something, but there are stories, for example. I understand what you're saying, and I want to give you a broader or different perspective. I'm not saying you're wrong. And I'm not saying what I'm about to say.
I'm not saying I'm right.
I'm not saying what I'm about to say is right. There are stories, for example, of, you know, we've done like a lot of stories of, like, you know, from the Gemara, like, you know, a non-Jew is begging and a Jew comes along and gives them money, and they say, oh, thank you, and the Jew says, don't thank me, thank the God of Israel who's commanded us to give money to people who are in need, right? So there's a notion of Kiddush Hashem, which it expands. It's like a hidur, right? The concept of hidur mitzvah, of beautifying a mitzvah, right? Which is why people put gold and silver on a Sefer Torah, you know, put the crown on, for example, right? The concept of Ze Keli V'Anvehu, this is God and I will beautify, you know. And so you can say, you know, it also, like, yeah, I feel I'm a compassionate person. I see somebody suffering, I want to relieve their suffering. And at the same time, like, it's also an expression of, it's not just that the Torah commands me to give money to this person right now, but the Torah is a way of life that I've embraced. And B'ezras Hashem, I'm trying to have that, you know, filter into everything that I do, become part of the fabric of my being, right? So I see a poor person, I'm moved, I feel, oh, compassion, I have money, Baruch Hashem, I want to go over and give them money, right? I go over and I give them money. And at the same time, it's like, wow, and this is also me connecting to the Jewish people, to Torah, to God, to... I would just want to suggest that we can, that instead of saying that the Torah commands me to do it, therefore that trumps my compassion, I want to suggest that maybe we can see that as, that it adds another dimension that we wouldn't have had otherwise.
Maybe we can think it in our mind, but as we do it for them, whatever we're doing, we're still getting credit because this is Torah, I'm doing Torah. You don't have to say it that way to him. And if he says something,
that's different. That depends on the setting. Let me B'ezras Hashem finish this up so that we can at least complete this today. And then, I mean, these are important things. These are exactly, I think, what Rambam encourages us to think about all the time. So, kol hakavod, right? So what's the purpose of halacha? So the purpose of prophecy is to correct people's behavior. The purpose of halacha is to give us guideposts. You know, if you take somebody out in the desert and you drop them in the middle of the desert and you say, okay, you walk for 20 miles in straight line and don't worry, you'll get to a big city and you'll have water and everything else, right? The person doesn't have a compass and there's no signposts and there are no landmarks, whatever, nothing to guide them by, right? You walk and walk and walk and walk and walk. What happens is that people will walk in a big circle. You can't walk in just a straight line without something to guide you by, okay? So that's what the halacha does. The halacha gives us kind of it gives us a lane to walk in, right? So that we know that at least it points us in the right direction. And then sometimes when we need course correction, the prophet comes along and says, dude, you know, you thought you were doing it right. But you were too focused on, I'm giving you this tzedakah because I haven't checked that box on the checklist of mitzvahs for today yet. And if I don't give it to you, then who can I give it to? So, you know, here, take the money, right? Okay? Kind of better to do it that way than not to do it at all. But that's not what the Torah really wants from us, right? So looking again back at the chapters of this book, the way that we frame them and the characters and the episodes that are hinted at in the text, they also paint a picture. It's an outline, if not of a divine plan, then maybe of a divine wish, if not expectation. Again, first 4 chapters, creation from inside and outside, the physical and metaphysical. Chapter 5, Adam and Eve in the garden. Chapter 6, Cain and Abel. If the goal of existence is the knowledge of God, I would suggest that these initial characters fall short. In a sense, they don't know God because God is part of the fabric of the nature that they live in, right? When you wake up in the morning as Adam and God says, good morning, I don't think like, oh, there's God. I think, oh yeah, that's, it's like, there's the dog comes in and out of the room, God comes in and out of the room, and Chava comes in and out of the room. It's just part of the fabric of my existence, okay? But now we know that the knowledge of God exists and it's something that we want to strive towards. So now enter Abraham in chapter 7 into the world of the heroic, of people in the Torah who actively seek a knowledge of God, right? Rambam's definition of prophecy encompasses an intellectual, spiritual, and creative striving to obtain that knowledge and to sustain that knowledge. The process reaches its pinnacle with Moshe Rabbeinu in chapter 8. And when we move into chapters 9 and chapter 10, now we're suddenly faced with people who do not know God and maybe don't particularly want to know God and maybe even knowingly turn away from God. Okay, so we mentioned Rav Kook last time around. I just want to close with this. All we can do is try to understand what it is that God wants of us, right? We quoted Rav Kook last time. We have an obligation in every generation at all times and under all circumstances to promote good and to prevent evil. Our actions must be geared to the times. Our words must be chosen for maximum impact on those who hear them. Right? So as Rav Kook said last time, there are certain times where you teach Torah in one way and certain times where you teach Torah in a different way, and certain times where you don't teach it as Torah, but you teach it as like, hey, how about if we looked at the world this way and behave that way in order to kind of prime the pump so that people will then in the next generation be ready to receive the Torah. Just as the prophets have a divine dispensation to temporarily suspend a mitzvah, the rabbis have the authority and the obligation to set parameters for our observance. The Kohanim had the obligation to teach all of Israel, but they withheld the Torah because they said, oh, we don't want it to fall in the hands of those who are not really capable or not suitable or whatever. And what that led to was it led to Torah being lost in Israel. It led to a demoralization of society and to an abandonment of Torah. The task of transmitting Torah is complex. It requires endless commitment and patience. It's not enough to criticize people who don't observe mitzvot. And it may actually be a sin to criticize people, certainly to do it to their face. Those who don't observe rarely do so out of a learned and deep philosophical aversion to Torah. Okay, Elisha ben Abuya is he's like a once, not just once in a generation, he's once in the whole Gemara occurrence, okay? But those of us striving to live a prophet Torah life day to day should be wary of judging others. Our job is to promote the spread of Torah, not to criticize others who choose not to live our lifestyle. The best we can do perhaps is to leave the exceptions to those gifted with prophecy. Ed la'asot Hashem heferu toratecha. There's a pasuk from Tehillim that's brought over and over again. It's time that we have to take extreme measures on behalf of the Torah for God, because they've abandoned God's Torah. They cast aside God's Torah. But who's to say? So we say that in this life that we change the world one human being at a time. So Be'ezrat Hashem, in this lifetime, I'm the one I'm hoping to change. All right. Finally, the Sefer ends with Rambam explaining that one prophet can designate another as a prophet. So this is perhaps the ultimate expression of, or support of, the authority of the rabbis. It's smicha, the conveyance of Torah from one person to the next, from one generation to the next. And Be'ezrat Hashem, may the chain remain unbroken. Let us finish Be'ezrat Hashem. V'lo niyeh holchim u'menasim la'olam. We shouldn't keep on testing a prophet over and over again. Shene'emar lo tenasu et Hashem Elokechem ka'asher nisiten b'masa. You should not test God the way you did, back in the Midbar. She'amru hayesh Hashem b'kabeno imayin. What we said, when we came out of Mitzrayim, we came through the sea, and then we said, oh, there's no water. Where's God? What, is God with us or not? Okay? Ella me'achar she'noda she'zeh navi. But no. Once we know that a person is a navi, ya'aminu v'yed'u ki Hashem b'kirbo v'lo yiharu v'lo yichashavu acharav ke'inyan she'ne'emar v'yed'u ki navi haya b'tocham. But rather, once an individual is established as a prophet, we believe in him and know that God is in our midst. And we should not doubt or question him. As it says in the book of Ezekiel, they shall know that the prophet was in their midst. Oh, Adonai le'olam, amen, amen. Thank you so much.